He turned, puzzled, his sharp eyes scanning the colorful chaos around him. Stalls brimming with fresh produce, handmade crafts, and vibrant flowers filled the air with a cacophony of scents and sounds. This wasn't the kind of place he usually frequented. Ethan preferred sleek boardrooms, silent luxury, and tailored suits, not dusty sidewalks and haggling vendors. Yet there he was, and now someone had called his name. His gaze landed on her. At first he didn't recognize her. The woman stood behind a flower stall, arranging a bucket of orange marigolds with a practiced ease. Her fiery red hair, falling in soft waves, framed a face dusted with freckles. There was a warmth to her, a quiet resilience that seemed out of place in his world of hard lines and sharper edges. It wasn't until her green eyes locked with his that the memories came rushing back. Rose. He felt his chest tighten. The Rose Miller he remembered wasn't this confident woman standing before him, hands dusted with pollen and wearing a faint smile. She had been a small-town girl, full of dreams that mirrored his own, back when he was young, reckless, and unburdened by wealth. He hadn't seen her in over 2 decades, not since the day he boarded the bus to chase his ambitions, leaving her behind without so much as a proper goodbye. "Rose," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I do remember me," she replied with a small laugh, though her tone carried an edge. "For a moment I thought I might have been mistaken. Millionaires like you don't usually show up at markets like this." Ethan stiffened at her words. Her comment wasn't entirely wrong. He had come here only by accident, scouting the area for potential real estate opportunities. This street, with its lively market and foot traffic, had potential for redevelopment, a shiny new mall perhaps. He hadn't planned to buy flowers, let alone run into the woman he had once promised forever. "You sell flowers now?" The question left his mouth before he could stop it, and it sounded harsher than he intended. Rose tilted her head, her smile fading into something colder. "I do, is that a problem?" "No," he said quickly, shaking his head. "Not at all, He faltered, unsure how to bridge the 20 years that stretched between them. "It's just unexpected." "For you, maybe," Rose said, turning her attention back to the marigolds. "But this has been my life for a long time. What about you? Still chasing skyscrapers and boardrooms?" Ethan hesitated. "I suppose you could say that." "Good for you," she said, though there was no enthusiasm in her voice. "Must be nice to have the kind of life you always wanted." The words stung more than Ethan cared to admit. He didn't miss the slight emphasis on the word you, a reminder of how his dreams had come at a cost, one that Rose had paid alongside him, or rather, one she had paid alone. "What about you?" he asked. "Is this—" He gestured to the stall. "What you wanted?" Rose looked up, meeting his gaze squarely. "What I wanted stopped mattering a long time ago. Life has a way of deciding for you, doesn't it?" The honesty in her words struck Ethan harder than he expected. He tried to think of something to say, something that would fill the awkward silence growing between them, but nothing felt right. The polished businessman, always quick with a sharp reply in meetings, suddenly found himself speechless. "I should go," he said finally, though he didn't move. "It was nice seeing you again." Rose's lips twitched into a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "You too, Ethan. Take care." He nodded and turned to leave, weaving through the crowd without looking back. But as he walked, her words lingered in his mind, louder than the chatter of the market or the sound of vendors calling out their wares. What she wanted had stopped mattering. The phrase gnawed at him. Rose had once been full of ambition, just like him. She had dreamed of becoming an artist, of opening a gallery in the city where her paintings could hang alongside the greats. Now she was selling flowers in a bustling market, a world apart from the life they had imagined together. Ethan found himself slowing, his feet dragging as he replayed their conversation. There had been no bitterness in her voice, no accusations, yet her words had carried a quiet weight, a reminder of a choice he had made long ago, a choice that had left her behind. He stopped walking and looked back toward the market. From this distance, her stall was just another splash of color among many, but Ethan couldn't shake the image of her standing there, surrounded by flowers, her hands steady and her expression unreadable. For the first time in years, Ethan Carter, the man who had built an empire on confidence and decisiveness, found himself questioning the direction of his life. And for the first time in years, he felt the faint stirrings of something he thought he had long since buried: regret. Ethan couldn't sleep that night. The hum of the city outside his penthouse, usually a comforting reminder of the empire he'd built, seemed louder than usual. He stood by the window, staring at the skyline, a drink in his hand, and thought about Rose, about her words, about her life now. He had told himself long ago that leaving her behind had been necessary. She wouldn't have understood his hunger for success, he'd thought. She would have slowed him down, tethered him to a life he had outgrown. Yet standing in that flower stall today, looking into her eyes, he hadn't seen someone left behind. He'd seen someone who had found something he wasn't sure he had anymore. The next day he found himself back at the market. He told himself it was coincidence that he was here to finalize his real estate deal. But as he approached her stall, weaving through the throngs of shoppers, the truth became harder to ignore. Rose was there, just as he'd left her, carefully arranging blooms in bright buckets. Today, it was sunflowers. Their cheerful yellow seemed at odds with the quiet tension in his chest. She saw him before he spoke. Her eyes flicked up from her work, her hands freezing for the briefest moment before she continued arranging. "Twice in 2 days," she said, her tone neutral. "Should I be flattered or concerned?" "I was in the area," Ethan lied. He immediately regretted it. Rose had always seen through him, and her raised eyebrow told him today was no different. "Is that so?" she replied. Her voice was light, but there was a challenge in her eyes. "I didn't realize the corporate world made room for wandering markets." Ethan hesitated, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to being caught off guard. "I wanted to apologize," he said finally, "for yesterday. I didn't mean to sound so condescending," she offered. "Curious," he corrected, though he couldn't suppress a wry smile at her bluntness. "You're not how I pictured you'd be." Rose leaned against the stall, crossing her arms. "And how did you picture me, Ethan? Still waiting for you? Stuck in some small-town life?" The words hit harder than he expected. "No," he said quietly. "That's not what I meant." "Good," she said, though her voice softened. "Because I'm not the same person I was back then, and neither are you." Ethan didn't reply right away. He watched her as she moved to adjust the display of sunflowers, her movements efficient and precise. "You're right," he said finally. "We've both changed. But I never stopped wondering about you, Rose." That made her pause. She looked at him, her green eyes narrowing slightly. "Wondering what? Where you went, what you did, if you were happy." She let out a small laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Well, now you know I'm here, selling flowers. Pretty simple, isn't it?" "It doesn't have to be," Ethan said, before he could stop himself. Rose's gaze sharpened, and he immediately regretted his words. "I didn't mean—" "Doesn't have to be what, Ethan?" she interrupted. "Hard? Small? Beneath you?" She shook her head, her lips pressing into a tight line. "I don't need you to feel sorry for me." "I'm not sorry for you," Ethan said quickly. "I'm sorry for me, for what I—" He stopped, his throat tightening. "For what I gave up." Rose stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she sighed and stepped around the stall, standing just a few feet away from him. "Ethan," she said softly, "I'm not angry at you. Not anymore. I was, for a long time, but I let it go. I had to." He nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. "I don't think I ever let it go," he admitted. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she studied him, as if trying to figure out what kind of man he had become. "Why are you really here?" she asked finally. Ethan hesitated. He wanted to give her the polished answer, the kind he used in boardrooms and negotiations. But looking at her now, he knew she'd see through it. So he told her the truth. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I saw you yesterday, and it brought back everything. The good, the bad, the choices I made. I thought I could just walk away and keep going like I always do, but I couldn't." Rose's expression softened slightly, though there was still caution in her eyes. "You can't change the past, Ethan." "I know," he said, "but maybe I can make up for it, in some way." She shook her head. "You don't owe me anything. I've made my peace with it. You should, too." Her words were kind, but they didn't ease the ache in his chest. He nodded anyway, knowing there was no point in arguing. "Can I at least buy some flowers?" he asked, forcing a small smile. Rose looked at him for a moment before a faint smile tugged at her lips. "Sure," she said, turning back to the stall. "What'll it be? Sunflowers? Daisies? Or something a little more exotic?" "Surprise me," he said, watching as she began to assemble a bouquet. For a moment it felt like old times, easy, familiar, almost natural. But as she handed him the bouquet and their fingers brushed, the weight of the years between them came rushing back. "Thanks, Rose," he said, taking the flowers. "I mean it." She nodded, her smile faint but genuine. "Take care, Ethan." As he walked away, the scent of the flowers in his hand, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Not yet. The bouquet sat on the corner of Ethan's sprawling glass desk, an unusual splash of color in an otherwise sterile modern office. He hadn't planned to bring the flowers here, but leaving them at home felt wrong. Every time he glanced at them, their bright petals seemed to mock him, reminding him of the woman who had handed them to him, with a calm finality that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He leaned back in his chair, loosening his tie as his mind wandered back to Rose. The conversation they had replayed in his head all morning, her voice clear and calm, her words cutting deeper than any criticism he'd endured in the boardroom. She had let him go, or so she claimed, but he couldn't stop wondering, had she truly moved on? Or had she simply buried the past the way he had, under layers of success and routine? For the first time in years, Ethan allowed himself to think back to that summer, the one that changed everything. He closed his eyes, and the memories came flooding back. They had been inseparable back then, two dreamers in a small town that felt too small for their ambitions. He was the son of a factory worker, always tinkering with ideas of how to escape a life of punching the clock. She was the artist, always with a sketchbook in hand, her fingers smudged with charcoal or paint. They'd spent long afternoons at the park, sprawled out on the grass, talking about everything they'd do once they left. "I'll open a gallery," Rose had said one day, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Someplace in the city where people actually care about art, and I'll paint every day. All kinds of things, landscapes, portraits, abstracts, whatever inspires me." Ethan had smiled, watching her as she sketched the skyline of a city they had only ever seen in magazines. "And I'll build a business," he'd said. "Something big, something that'll make people remember my name." Rose had laughed, teasing him. "Always about the money with you, isn't it?" "It's not just about the money," he'd protested, though even then he wasn't entirely sure he believed it. "It's about freedom, about not being stuck here." She had nodded, her expression softening. "As long as you don't forget what's really important." He hadn't understood what she meant at the time, or maybe he had, and he just didn't want to face it. Either way, he had pushed the thought aside, convinced that love and ambition could coexist, that they would leave together, chase their dreams together. But when the offer came, an internship with a prestigious firm in the city, everything changed. The opportunity was everything he had worked for, a chance to finally escape. The only catch was the timing. He had to leave immediately. Rose had been quiet when he told her, her usual spark dimmed. "So that's it?" she'd asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're just going?" "It's not like that," he'd said, reaching for her hand. "This is my chance, Rose, our chance. Once I'm settled, I'll come back for you, I promise." She had pulled her hand away. "And what am I supposed to do in the meantime? Just wait? Put my life on hold while you figure yours out?" "Of course not," he'd said quickly. "You can focus on your art, get ready for the gallery." "Ethan," she'd interrupted, her voice breaking, "be honest with me. Do you really think this is going to work? Us being apart?" He had hesitated just for a moment, but it was enough. She had seen the doubt in his eyes, and it had broken something between them. "I see," she'd said, her voice flat. "I guess this is goodbye then." "It doesn't have to be," he'd insisted. But she had already turned away, her shoulders stiff, her head bowed. The next morning he had boarded the bus without saying another word. Ethan opened his eyes, the memory leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. He had told himself for years that he'd done the right thing, that Rose was better off without him, that she deserved someone who could give her the life she wanted. But the truth was he had been afraid of failing, afraid of being tied down, afraid of not living up to his own lofty expectations. And now, sitting in his corner office, surrounded by everything he had worked for, he couldn't help but wonder, had it been worth it? His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Darren, his business partner. "Meeting at 2. Investors are ready to pull the trigger on the market project. Need your approval." Ethan stared at the message, his mind drifting back to Rose's flower stall. Would she even be there once the project was complete? Would the vibrant market survive the sleek, soulless development he was planning? For the first time in his career, he didn't feel a surge of pride at the prospect of closing the deal. Instead, he felt a pang of something else, something uncomfortably close to guilt. He grabbed his phone and typed a reply. "Postpone the meeting. I need more time to think." The response came almost immediately. "More time? What's there to think about? It's a slam dunk." Ethan didn't bother replying. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting back to the bouquet on his desk. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure what his next move should be. Ethan found himself standing at the edge of the market again the next morning, his polished shoes entirely out of place on the uneven pavement. The air was filled with the hum of voices, the occasional laugh, and the distant tune of a street musician playing a weathered guitar. It was chaotic, loud, and a world apart from his ordered existence. Yet, here he was, drawn back to this place that felt inexplicably alive. Rose was there, as he knew she would be, arranging bouquets with the same practiced ease as before. Today it was daisies and lavender, the soft purple blooms contrasting with the white and yellow. She worked methodically, her movements calm but focused, as if the flowers demanded her complete attention. Ethan hesitated before approaching, unsure of what to say. The bouquet she had sold him yesterday was still sitting on his desk, its presence unnerving in a way he couldn't fully explain. It had made him question things he thought were long settled, and now he was here, hoping to untangle the mess of emotions she had stirred up. "Back so soon?" Rose's voice cut through his thoughts, light but tinged with curiosity. She didn't look up from the daisies she was arranging. "Didn't think flowers were your thing." "They're not," Ethan admitted, stepping closer to the stall. "But maybe they should be." Rose glanced up at him then, one eyebrow raised. "Is that so? Or are you just looking for another excuse to be here?" He smiled faintly, appreciating her directness, even as it unsettled him. "Maybe a bit of both." Rose shook her head, but there was a trace of amusement in her expression. "Well, as long as you're here, you might as well make yourself useful. Hand me those scissors." She nodded toward a pair of garden shears sitting at the edge of the table. Ethan reached for them, surprised by how natural it felt to slip into her orbit. He handed her the scissors, watching as she deftly trimmed the stems of a handful of lavender. The scent wafted up, earthy and calming, and for a moment he forgot why he had come. "So," Rose said, not looking up, "what's the real reason you're here, Ethan? You don't seem like the type to wander markets for fun." Ethan leaned against the edge of the stall, his hands in his pockets. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about the past, about us." Rose paused, her hands stilling for a moment before she resumed her work. And I realized there's a lot I never said, a lot I never apologized for." His voice was quieter now, stripped of the confidence he usually wore like armor. "I made promises I didn't keep. I left without really thinking about what it meant for you. I was selfish." Rose didn't respond right away. She set down the scissors and began tying the lavender and daisies into small bundles. "You were young," she said finally, her tone even. "We both were. You did what you thought you had to do. That doesn't make it right." "No," she agreed, glancing up at him, "but it doesn't make it unforgivable either." Ethan felt a flicker of relief at her words, but it was quickly overshadowed by the weight of what he still wanted to say. "I know I can't change the past," he said, "but seeing you here, seeing the life you've built, it made me realize how much I lost when I walked away." Rose's hands stilled again, and this time she didn't pick up where she left off. She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Ethan," she said carefully, "I'm not the same person I was back then, and I don't think you are either. Whatever we had, it's a memory now. A good one, but a memory." "I know," he said quickly, though the words stung. "But maybe it doesn't have to stay that way." Rose sighed, setting down the bundle of flowers she'd been working on. "You're a hard man to pin down, you know that? You disappear for 20 years and then suddenly you're here talking about the past like it's something we can just pick up again." "I'm not asking to pick it up again," Ethan said. I want to understand, to know what I missed." She studied him for a long moment, her green eyes searching his face. Then, without a word, she turned and grabbed 2 stools from behind the stall, setting them up across from each other. "If you're going to keep showing up here," she said, sitting down, "you might as well stay for a while." Ethan hesitated, caught off guard by her sudden shift, but he took the seat she offered. For the next hour they talked, not about the past, but about the present. Rose told him about her parents, who had passed away within a few years of each other, leaving her the flower shop they had run in the small town they both grew up in. When the shop closed, she moved to the city, deciding to keep the trade alive at the market. It wasn't the gallery she had dreamed of, but it gave her purpose. Ethan listened, absorbing every detail, his questions careful and deliberate. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about his next move or calculating the angles. He was just there, fully present, in the moment. When the hour ended and customers began to trickle back to her stall, Rose stood brushing her hands on her apron. "Thanks for keeping me company," she said, her tone lighter now. "Any time," Ethan said, standing as well. He hesitated for a moment, then added, "I'll see you around, Rose." She didn't reply, but as he walked away, he caught a glimpse of her faint smile, and for the first time in years, He felt something stir within him, something he hadn't realized he'd been missing. Ethan arrived at the market the next morning earlier this time. The stalls were still being set up, the air filled with the sounds of crates being unloaded and tarps being pulled back. The market was quieter at this hour, the usual chaos of buyers and sellers replaced by a sense of calm anticipation. He spotted Rose at her stall, her back turned as she arranged buckets of fresh lilies and wildflowers. He hesitated, unsure if she'd even want to see him again so soon, but he had come this far, and the knot of unresolved tension in his chest wouldn't let him stay away. Taking a deep breath, he approached the stall. "You're persistent, I'll give you that," Rose said without turning around. She must have heard his footsteps, or maybe she simply knew. "Most people don't show up before the market opens." Ethan smiled faintly. "Guess I'm not most people." Rose straightened, turning to face him. "No, you're not. But that doesn't mean you belong here either." Her tone was light, but her words carried an edge. She gestured to the stalls around them. "This isn't your world, Ethan." "It could have been," he said quietly. The words slipped out before he could stop them, and the look on her face told him he had struck a nerve. Rose's expression hardened. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I made a choice," Ethan said, stepping closer. "A choice I've been thinking about every day since I saw you again. And for the first time, I'm not sure I made the right one." Rose laughed, but it wasn't a warm sound. "You've had 20 years to figure that out, Ethan. Why now? Because you saw me selling flowers and suddenly felt guilty?" "It's not guilt," he said, his voice firm. "It's regret. And it's not just about you. It's about me, too. About what I left behind." Rose crossed her arms, her gaze piercing. "Do you even know what you left behind? Or are you just here because it's easier than dealing with whatever's wrong in your life now?" The accusation stung, but Ethan knew she wasn't entirely wrong. He had spent years building his empire, focusing on what he thought mattered most: wealth, power, respect. Yet here he was, standing in front of her, feeling more unmoored than ever. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "Maybe it's both. All I know is that seeing you again made me realize how much I've lost. And not just with you, with myself, the person I used to be." Rose's expression softened, but only slightly. "The person you used to be," she repeated. "You mean the dreamer? The one who talked about freedom and possibilities but left the moment a better opportunity came along?" Ethan flinched at her words, but he didn't deny them. "I was scared," he said after a long pause. "Scared of failing, of being stuck in that town forever. Scared of not becoming the man I wanted to be." "And what about me?" Rose asked, her voice trembling just slightly. "What about the promises you made? Did you even think about how scared I was? About how much you were asking me to give up for you?" Ethan met her gaze, the weight of her words pressing down on him. "I did," he said, "but I convinced myself you'd be better off without me. That you deserved someone who could give you more than I ever could." "That wasn't your decision to make," Rose said, her tone sharp. "You didn't even give me a chance to decide. You just left." "I know," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I've been running from that ever since." For a long moment neither of them spoke. The sounds of the market around them grew louder as more vendors arrived, but they might as well have been standing in silence. Finally Rose sighed and turned back to her flowers, her hands moving methodically as she tied a bundle of lilies together. "You were right to leave," she said finally. "You had dreams, and you chased them. I can't fault you for that. But don't stand here and tell me you regret it. You made your choice, Ethan, and so did I." "What choice?" he asked, stepping closer again. "To stay? To sell flowers instead of painting the way you wanted?" Rose turned to him, her eyes blazing. "Don't you dare," she said, her voice low. "Don't stand there and pity me. I didn't give up on my dreams, Ethan. Life just changed them. I had to take care of my parents when they got sick, and when they were gone, this," she gestured to the flowers, "was all I had left. It wasn't the life I planned, but it's mine, and I'm proud of it." Ethan swallowed hard, her words cutting through him like a blade. "I'm not pitying you," he said. "I'm trying to understand, to make sense of what I walked away from." Rose sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "You can't make sense of it," she said, "because it's not your life anymore. It's mine. And I don't need you to fix it, Ethan. I don't need you to make up for the past." Ethan nodded slowly, his chest tight with emotions he couldn't fully name. "I don't want to fix your life," he said. I want to be a part of it again. Somehow." Rose stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then she turned back to her flowers, picking up the bundle of lilies and tying it off with a piece of twine. "I don't know if that's possible," she said quietly, "but I guess we'll see." It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. And for now, that was enough. The next few weeks unfolded in a strange rhythm. Ethan found himself at the market almost daily, drawn back to Rose's stall like a moth to a flame. She didn't tell him to leave, but she didn't welcome him with open arms either. Their conversations were polite, peppered with occasional jabs and guarded smiles. Each encounter was a delicate dance. 1 step forward, 2 steps back. Today, Ethan arrived in the early afternoon, dressed more casually than usual. He had traded his tailored suit for a simple sweater and jeans, trying to blend into the market's vibrant chaos. Rose noticed immediately, her lips quirking into a faint smile as he approached. "Look at you," she said, gesturing at his outfit. "You almost look like you belong here." Ethan chuckled, though her teasing hit closer to home than she probably realized. "Figured I'd try something different," he said. "Maybe learn a thing or two." Rose handed him a bouquet she had just finished wrapping. "Well, if you're sticking around, make yourself useful. Deliver this to Mrs. Patel at the spice stall." He blinked, caught off guard. "You're putting me to work now." Rose shrugged, a mischievous glint in her eye. "You said you wanted to learn. Here's your chance." With a reluctant smile, Ethan took the bouquet and made his way through the market. The task was simple enough, but as he navigated the bustling crowd, he couldn't help but notice how different this world was from his own. The vendors greeted each other with familiarity, their laughter and banter carrying over the noise. Customers lingered at stalls, chatting with sellers about their goods. There was a warmth here, a sense of community that felt foreign to him. When he returned to Rose's stall, she was helping a young girl pick out flowers for her mother. Her voice was soft, her demeanor patient, as she crouched to the girl's height, letting her choose each bloom. Ethan watched from a distance, struck by the ease with which she moved through this world. She belonged here in a way he never had anywhere. As the girl skipped away with her bouquet, Ethan approached the stall. "Mrs. Patel says thank you," he said, setting his hands on the counter, "and she threw in some masala for your trouble." Rose grinned, holding up a small paper bag of spices. "She's a sweetheart. Her family's been selling here for decades." "Everyone seems to know you," Ethan said, gesturing to the other vendors. "You're like the queen of the market." Rose laughed, shaking her head. "Hardly, but I've been here long enough that people get used to seeing me around. It's not like your world, though. No competition or backstabbing here, just people trying to make a living." Ethan leaned against the counter, her words sinking in. "It's different," he admitted. "I'm used to everything being a transaction. Here, it's more personal." Rose glanced at him, her expression softening. "That's because it is personal. These people aren't just vendors. They're my neighbors, my friends. We take care of each other." He nodded, a pang of something uncomfortably close to envy twisting in his chest. He thought about his own world, the cutthroat meetings, the relentless drive for more. How many of his colleagues could he truly call friends? How often had he felt this sense of connection? Rose seemed to sense his unease. She leaned on the counter, her gaze steady. "What's it like, your life?" she asked. "Really, beyond the money and the suits?" Ethan hesitated, unsure how to put it into words. "It's busy," he said finally. "Everything moves fast. There's always another deal to close, another goal to hit." "And that makes you happy?" Rose asked, her tone neutral. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Did it make him happy? It was a question he hadn't let himself ask in years. "It's what I'm good at," he said instead, his voice quieter now. "It's what I've built my whole life around." "That's not what I asked," Rose said gently. Ethan looked away, the truth pressing down on him. "I don't know," he admitted. "I used to think it did, but now I'm not so sure." Rose studied him for a moment, her gaze softening. "You know, you don't have to have all the answers right now," she said. "Sometimes it's okay to just figure it out as you go." He nodded, her words offering a small measure of comfort. "What about you?" he asked. "Are you happy?" Rose smiled faintly, her eyes drifting to the flowers around her. "I am," she said. "It's not the life I planned, but it's mine. And I've learned to appreciate the small things. A good day at the market, a kind word from a customer. Sometimes that's enough." Ethan felt a strange mix of emotions, admiration, guilt, and a longing he couldn't quite define. He envied her contentment, her ability to find joy in the simple things. It was a stark contrast to his own restless ambition, always chasing the next big thing. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the market in a warm golden light, Rose began packing up her stall. Ethan offered to help, and she didn't refuse. They worked in comfortable silence, the rhythm of the market winding down around them. When the last bucket of flowers was loaded onto her cart, Rose turned to him, a small smile on her lips. "Thanks for the help, Ethan. I didn't think you had it in you." He laughed softly. "I'm full of surprises." Rose's smile widened, but there was a trace of something deeper in her eyes, something she wasn't ready to say. "See you tomorrow?" she asked, her voice light. Ethan nodded, his chest tightening at the thought. "Yeah, see you tomorrow." As he walked away, the lingering scent of flowers clinging to his clothes, Ethan felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of possibility. The next day, Ethan arrived at the market, armed with a plan. He had spent the entire night wrestling with an idea that had taken root the moment Rose mentioned how much she valued the small community at the market. If he could use his resources to help her, perhaps expand her flower business, or give her something closer to the gallery she had once dreamed of, then maybe he could finally make things right. Or at least, it would be a start. The market was already alive with activity when he arrived, but Rose's stall was as tranquil as ever. She was standing behind the counter, chatting with an elderly woman who was carefully inspecting a bundle of carnations. Rose smiled at something the woman said, her laughter light and easy. For a moment, Ethan hesitated. What if his idea didn't come across the way he intended? What if she misunderstood his intentions? "Ethan," Rose called out, noticing him standing awkwardly at the edge of the stall. "You're here early. Decided to go full market regular?" "Something like that," he said, stepping closer. He nodded to the elderly woman, who smiled politely before wandering off with her purchase. When they were alone, Ethan cleared his throat. "Got a minute?" Rose tilted her head, intrigued. "For you? Sure. What's on your mind?" He glanced around, suddenly hyper-aware of the bustling market. "Can we talk somewhere private?" Rose raised an eyebrow but gestured toward the small workspace behind her stall. "All right," she said, leading the way. The area was cluttered with buckets of flowers, tools, and stacks of twine, but it felt warm and lived in. Rose leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. "So what's this about?" Ethan took a deep breath, his hands stuffed into his pockets. "I've been thinking about what you said, about your life, the market, everything." "And?" she prompted, her tone cautious. "And I want to help," he said, the words tumbling out faster than he intended. "I can see how much this place means to you, how much your business means to you, but you deserve more than just selling flowers at a market stall. You're talented, Rose. You always have been. What if you had your own shop, or a space to display your art?" Rose's expression froze, her green eyes narrowing. "Ethan, just hear me out," he said quickly. "I'm not saying you should change your life completely. I'm saying I could help you expand it, give you the resources to grow. You wouldn't have to worry about money or logistics. You could focus on the things you love." Rose stared at him, her silence more damning than any words she could have said. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but sharp. "You think I'm not happy?" "That's not what I meant," Ethan said, flustered. I see so much potential in you, Rose. You could do so much more." Rose's laugh was short and humorless. "More. There it is again. That word. More money, more success, more ambition. That's always been your thing, hasn't it, Ethan?" "It's not like that," he insisted. "This isn't about me. It's about you." "No," she said firmly. "It's about you. You think throwing money at me will make up for the choices you made. But I don't need your money, Ethan. I don't need you to fix my life." Ethan felt the weight of her words settle in his chest, but he wasn't ready to back down. "I'm not trying to fix anything. I just want to help." "Help how?" Rose asked, her voice rising. "By turning my life into something it's not. By taking away the things that actually make me happy." "You don't get it, Ethan. You never have. This isn't about potential or growth or whatever else you're chasing. This is my life. It's messy and imperfect, but it's mine, and I like it the way it is." Ethan took a step back, stunned by the force of her response. He had thought she would be grateful, or at least open to the idea. But instead, she looked at him like he was a stranger. "I didn't mean to insult you," he said quietly. "I know you didn't," she replied, her tone softening slightly. "But that's the problem, Ethan. You're still trying to fit me into your world, your way of thinking, and I don't belong there." For a long moment they stood in silence. Ethan felt the sting of her rejection, but he also couldn't deny the truth in her words. He had been so focused on what he thought she needed that he hadn't stopped to consider what she actually wanted. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I didn't mean to overstep." Rose nodded, her expression still guarded. "I know you didn't, and I appreciate the thought, but if you really want to be in my life, you need to accept it for what it is. Not what you think it should be. Ethan nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling in. I'll try, he said, though he wasn't entirely sure what that meant. Good, Rose said, her voice soft but firm, because that's the only way this works. As he left the stall, Ethan felt a strange mix of emotions, disappointment, guilt, and an unfamiliar sense of humility. For the first time in his life, he was realizing that some things couldn't be bought, no matter how much money or influence he had. Some things, like Rose, had to be earned. Ethan sat alone in his penthouse, the city lights flickering like distant stars outside his window. The air was quiet, save for the faint hum of the traffic below, but his mind was anything but still. Rose's words echoed in his head, each one digging deeper than the last. You need to accept my life for what it is. For years, Ethan had lived by a simple rule. If something wasn't working, fix it. If a deal fell through, renegotiate. If a competitor threatened his position, outmaneuver them. Problems were just puzzles waiting to be solved. But Rose wasn't a problem. She wasn't something to be solved, fixed, or reshaped. And yet, he had tried to do just that. He sighed and leaned back in his chair, staring at the bouquet of flowers still sitting on his desk. The bright colors had begun to fade, the petals curling slightly at the edges. They were a stark reminder of how different Rose's world was from his. Simple, fleeting, and grounded in the here and now. His world, in contrast, was built on permanence. Towers of steel and glass that would stand long after he was gone. Deals and contracts that bound people to him. Yet, for all his success, he felt more fragile than ever. He reached for his phone and scrolled through his contacts, his thumb hovering over Rose's name. He had saved her number weeks ago, though he'd never had a reason to call. Now, as he stared at the screen, he felt an uncharacteristic hesitation. What would he even say? That he was sorry again? That he didn't know how to be the person she needed? Instead of calling, he set the phone down and walked to the window. The city stretched out before him, vast and unyielding. Somewhere down there, Rose was probably closing up her stall, preparing for another day of selling flowers. She would return to her small apartment, have a quiet dinner, and likely not spare him more than a passing thought. The realization stung, but it also grounded him. For the first time, he wondered if the distance between their worlds wasn't just a matter of choice, but of identity. Who was he, if not the ambitious, relentless man who built this empire? That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, his mind racing with questions he didn't have answers to. When morning came, he decided to do something he hadn't done in years, something he used to love, but had long since abandoned. He went for a drive. The road stretched ahead of him, winding through the hills just outside the city. The car, a sleek black convertible he rarely drove, roared beneath him, its engine a low, steady growl. The wind whipped through his hair, and for the first time in what felt like forever he felt untethered. No meetings, no calls, no deadlines, just the open road and his thoughts. As he drove, his mind drifted back to the person he used to be. The boy who dreamed of escaping his small town, who spent hours sketching business plans on the back of diner napkins. Back then, the world had seemed full of possibility, but somewhere along the way, that optimism had hardened into something else, something colder. He had achieved everything he set out to do, yet he felt further from himself than ever. By the time he returned to the city, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the skyline. He parked the car in his garage and took the elevator up to his penthouse. But instead of heading inside, he paused in the hallway, his gaze falling on the dusty bicycle leaning against the wall. It had been years since he'd ridden it, but the sight of it stirred something in him. A memory of lazy summer afternoons with Rose pedaling down country roads, the wind carrying their laughter. Without overthinking it, he grabbed the bike and took it down to the street. The market was quieter than usual when Ethan arrived, the stalls half empty as vendors began packing up for the day. He spotted Rose almost immediately. She was crouched by her stall, wiping down the buckets she used to hold her flowers. Her hair was tied back, her face flushed from the day's work. He walked the bike toward her, his heart pounding in a way that felt both ridiculous and entirely warranted. She looked up as he approached, her expression shifting from surprise to something softer. "Well, this is new," she said, straightening. "What's with the bike?" Ethan smiled, brushing a hand over the handlebars. "Figured I'd try something different. Thought it might help me clear my head." Rose raised an eyebrow, her lips twitching into a faint smile. "And did it?" "Not entirely," he admitted. "But it got me here." She studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Here for what exactly? Ethan hesitated, his grip tightening on the handlebars. To listen, he said finally. To stop talking and just listen. Rose's eyes softened, but she didn't respond right away. Instead, she turned back to her stall, wiping down the last bucket before setting it aside. All right, she said, her voice quiet. Then start listening. They sat down together on the edge of the stall, the city buzzing faintly around them. For the next hour, Rose talked, not about the past, but about her life now. She told him about the customers who brightened her day, the friends she had made in the market, the small joys she found in tending to her flowers. She spoke with a quiet contentment that Ethan both envied and admired. When she finished, she turned to him, her gaze steady. This is my life, Ethan, she said. It's not glamorous, and it's not perfect, but it's mine, and that's enough for me. Ethan nodded, his chest tight with a mix of emotions he couldn't quite name. I'm starting to see that, he said quietly, and I'm starting to understand why it matters so much to you. Rose smiled faintly, her eyes softening. Good, because if you're going to stick around, that's the only way this works. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt a sense of peace. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a start, and for now, that was enough. Ethan approached the market the next morning with a different kind of determination. He had spent the better part of the night reflecting on his conversation with Rose, replaying her words in his mind. For so long, his instinct had been to push, to fix, to negotiate, to control. But this time he decided to let go. He wasn't here to convince her of anything. He was here to be present, to meet her where she was. The market was already alive with its usual energy. Vendors called out to customers, the air thick with the mingling scents of fresh produce, spices, and flowers. When he reached Rose's stall, she was busy helping a young couple choose a bouquet, her hands deftly arranging roses and eucalyptus into a delicate arrangement. She looked up briefly, catching sight of him, and offered a small smile before returning to her work. He waited patiently at the edge of the stall, watching as she worked. There was something calming about the way she moved, her hands steady and sure, her voice warm and reassuring. For the first time, Ethan saw the beauty of what she had built here, not just a business, but a life rooted in connection and care. When the couple walked away, bouquet in hand, Rose turned to him, her eyebrow arched in curiosity. Back again? Starting to think you've got nowhere else to be. Ethan grinned. Maybe I don't. She laughed softly, shaking her head. All right, what's on your mind today? He stepped closer, his tone light but earnest. I was wondering if you'd let me help out just for the day. Rose blinked, clearly surprised. You want to work here? At the stall? Why not? He said, shrugging. I'm already here half the time anyway. Might as well make myself useful. She studied him for a moment, her expression skeptical but amused. All right, she said finally, but don't think I'm going easy on you. You're on bucket duty. Ethan laughed, rolling up his sleeves. Bucket duty, got it. For the next few hours, he followed her instructions without complaint. He refilled buckets with water, unloaded fresh shipments of flowers, and even managed to sell a few bouquets to customers. At first, he felt awkward, his polished demeanor clashing with the laid-back atmosphere of the market. But as the day went on, he began to relax, losing himself in the simple rhythm of the work. Rose watched him out of the corner of her eye, a faint smile playing on her lips. She didn't say much, but her approval was evident in the way she trusted him to handle more tasks. By the time the afternoon rush hit, they were working side by side, their movements synchronized in a way that felt effortless. At one point, a customer, a middle-aged woman with a warm smile, paused to comment. You two make a good team, she said, glancing between them. Rose chuckled, glancing at Ethan. We'll see how long he lasts. Ethan grinned, feeling an unexpected swell of pride. I think I'm getting the hang of it. By the time the market began to wind down, Ethan felt a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with money or power. His clothes were wrinkled, his hands smelled like flowers, and he was utterly exhausted. But for the first time in years, he felt grounded, real. As they packed up the stall, Rose handed him a small bundle of daisies and lavender. For your trouble, she said, her tone teasing but kind. Ethan accepted the flowers, his smile soft. Thanks. I think I've earned these. You did all right, Rose admitted, leaning against the cart. I'll give you that. He hesitated, then asked the question that had been lingering in his mind all day. Do you ever think about the gallery, about painting again? Rose's expression shifted, her smile fading into something more thoughtful. Sometimes, she said quietly. But not in the way you think. It's not something I need anymore. It's something I carry with me like a memory. It's a part of who I was, but it doesn't define who I am now. Ethan nodded, her words resonating in a way he hadn't expected. I get that, he said, or at least I'm starting to. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the city's golden hour glow casting soft shadows across the market. Finally, Rose broke the silence. You did good today, Ethan, she said, her voice warm. But don't think this means I'm hiring you full-time. He laughed, the sound light and genuine. Don't worry, I've still got my day job. She smiled, shaking her head. Good, because I'd hate to see you mess this up. As they said their goodbyes, Ethan felt a quiet sense of hope. It wasn't a grand gesture or a sweeping resolution, but it was something real, a beginning, and for now, that was enough. Ethan stood in front of Rose's stall the following weekend, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. The market was just beginning to stir, the air crisp and fresh, carrying the faint scent of flowers and baked bread from a nearby vendor. Rose was crouched behind her stall, tying burlap around small bundles of lavender. Her hair was loose today, catching the morning light in fiery waves. She looked peaceful, content in the quiet rhythm of her work. Thought you could use a pick-me-up, Ethan said, setting one of the cups on the counter. Rose glanced up, her lips curving into a faint smile. Bribing me with coffee now, are we? Not bribing, he said with a shrug. Just trying to earn some goodwill. Bucket duty is rough work, she chuckled, standing and wiping her hands on her apron before taking the cup. You survived it, didn't you? Barely. He leaned against the counter, watching as she took a sip of coffee. I was thinking, maybe I could stick around again today, if you need the help. Rose raised an eyebrow, though her smile lingered. Getting attached to the market life? Maybe, he said, his tone light. Or maybe I just like the company. Rose didn't respond immediately. Instead, she set her coffee down and busied herself with arranging a display of wildflowers. Ethan waited, giving her the space she always seemed to need before she opened up. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer now. You know, I didn't think you'd keep coming back. Why not? He asked, genuinely curious. Because this isn't your world, she said, glancing at him. It's slow, messy, and doesn't come with any guarantees. You're used to things being bigger, flashier. Ethan considered her words, then shook his head. Maybe that's why I keep coming back. I've spent so much of my life chasing bigger and flashier that I forgot what it's like to just be. Rose tilted her head, studying him. And now, he said, I'm starting to figure out what I actually want. She held his gaze for a moment, her green eyes searching his. Then she turned back to the flowers, her movements slower, more deliberate. You've changed, Ethan, she said quietly. Or at least you're trying to. I didn't think you had that in you. He smiled faintly. Neither did I. The morning passed in a comfortable rhythm. Ethan fell into the work more easily now, helping customers, restocking buckets, and even wrapping a few bouquets on his own. Rose seemed to warm to his presence, her teasing softer, her smiles more frequent. By the time the midday rush hit, they were moving in sync, their unspoken coordination turning the chaos into something almost enjoyable. As the afternoon wore on, Ethan noticed a group of children gathered near a vendor selling handmade trinkets. One of the kids, a boy no older than 7, was clutching a small crumpled bill in his hand as he stared longingly at a carved wooden bird. The vendor, a kind-looking man with a salt and pepper beard, bent down to speak to the boy, but the child shook his head and stepped back, his face falling. Ethan watched the exchange for a moment before slipping away from the stall. He approached the vendor quietly, slipping a larger bill into the man's hand and nodding toward the boy. The vendor hesitated, then smiled and called the child back over, handing him the bird as if it were a gift. When Ethan returned to Rose's stall, she was watching him, her expression unreadable. What was that about? She asked. Nothing, he said, brushing it off. Just felt like doing something nice. Rose didn't respond right away. Instead, she stepped closer, her voice quiet but firm. That's not nothing, Ethan. He met her gaze, surprised by the intensity in her eyes. It's just a small thing, he said. Not a big deal. It is to him, she said, and to me. The moment hung between them, charged with something unspoken. Ethan felt the weight of her words, the sincerity behind them, and for the first time, he began to understand what she had been trying to tell him all along. It wasn't about grand gestures or sweeping changes. It was about the small, meaningful choices that made life worth living. As the market began to wind down, Rose turned to him, her expression softer now. You know, she said, I could get used to having you around. Ethan smiled, the words warming something deep inside him. Does that mean I'm hired? Don't push your luck, she said, but her teasing tone was light, her smile genuine. They packed up the stall together, working in quiet harmony. When the last bucket was loaded onto her cart, Rose turned to him, her green eyes meeting his. Ethan, she said, her voice steady, I don't know what this is yet or what it could be, but I'm willing to find out if you are. He felt a lump rise in his throat, but he nodded, his smile unwavering. I am, he said simply. As they walked away from the market together, the setting sun casting a warm glow over the city, Ethan felt something he hadn't in years, a sense of peace, of hope. He didn't know where this road would lead, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid to find out. Because this time he wasn't walking it alone.